teacher was fired for protecting a poor child, but her new principal changed everything. This is the third time he has come to school with holes in his shoes, an empty stomach, and no one to walk him through the doors. And you are telling me he is a disruption to the class? Sarah's voice was quiet but firm, slicing through the stale air of the principal's office. Principal Blake didn't flinch. I said children like him do not belong in this environment. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows, rustling the bare trees of their small, worn-down Kentucky town. At Jefferson Elementary, discipline was king. Warmth came second, if at all. Sarah, 26, stood straight, blonde hair falling softly past her shoulders, her patched sweater pulled tight around her. Her boots were scuffed, her palms clenched. She had grown up with less than most, and carried that history not as shame, but as proof she had survived. Every morning she placed a single apple in her desk drawer, not for herself, but for whichever child needed it most. No one asked for it. Sometimes it disappeared, sometimes it stayed. Jack was often the one who took it. A fourth grader, thin, quiet, overlooked. His pants were always a size too big or too small, held together with twine. He rarely spoke but left behind tiny thank you gifts. A pencil stub, sharpened with care, tucked in her drawer. Once he left a bruised apple. She held it in her hand like it was made of gold. Later that day, Blake summoned her. "You've been reported," he said. Favoritism? Feeding a student, allowing Jack to stay after hours. "He is hungry," Sarah said, steady. Blake stood. "This is not a charity, Ms. Ellis. It's a school." "It should be both," she replied. He handed her a formal reprimand. Next time it will be termination. That night by candlelight, Sarah wrote a letter to the district. She asked them to review the school's treatment of underprivileged students. She signed it, folded it, sealed it with quiet hope. The next morning she arrived early and placed the envelope on Blake's desk. "What is this?" he asked. "A letter to the district." Blake opened it, read in silence, then, without a word, tore it in half. Then again, and again. "You do not speak for this institution," he said. "You don't challenge leadership." Sarah stood frozen, then turned and left. In the hallway, whispers followed her. Teachers avoided her eyes. She walked to her classroom, opened her drawer, and found it empty. No pencil stub, no apple, just silence. The termination letter came printed in bold black ink on Jefferson Elementary's official letterhead. It used the word incompatible 3 times, but the phrase that cut deepest was, effective immediately. Sarah read the letter alone in her classroom, the sky outside darkening with rain. Her hands shook slightly as she folded the paper and slipped it into her worn leather bag, the one she had carried since college. No one saw her leave the building. No goodbyes, no final glances. Just the sound of her boots echoing in the hallway as she stepped into the cold Kentucky rain. She walked home through puddles, past flickering streetlights and familiar landmarks, the diner where she worked weekends, the library where she read to children, the gas station where Jack's mother sometimes stood outside in silence. By the time she reached the trailer she shared with her grandmother, she was soaked through. Ruth opened the door, worry already in her eyes. "They did it, didn't they?" Sarah nodded, too tired to speak. Inside, she sat at the small kitchen table, her bag still pressed against her. Ruth made her a cup of tea and held her hand. "You're young, sweetheart. You can still choose a different path, one that doesn't break your heart." Sarah stared at the steam rising from her mug. Her voice was barely audible. "I was born to teach." The next morning, she began packing her books into boxes. She called the diner, asked for more hours. She considered leaving town, Lexington maybe, or farther, anywhere she would not have to explain why she had failed. But fate had other plans. That afternoon, the local paper ran a headline, "Teacher let go after feeding hungry student." The photo showed Sarah kneeling beside Jack, half hidden behind her skirt. The article called it a disputed case, outlining how she had broken school rules in the name of compassion. Some readers glanced and turned the page. Others whispered in grocery store aisles. but one man 60 miles away folded the paper carefully and read it again. Charles Cole, 34, was the headmaster of a small independent school called New Hope Academy. He believed in second chances and the kind of teachers who taught with their hearts. The story about Sarah didn't shock him, it moved him. That same evening he wrote her an email. "Dear Ms. Ellis, I read about you in the Herald today. I do not know all the details, nor do I need to. What I do know is that any teacher who gives a child an apple from her own lunch is the kind of teacher I want at New Hope Academy. If you are willing, I would like to meet." Sarah found the message the next morning, blinking at the screen. At first she thought it was a mistake, but the email address was real, the school had a website, and the words felt sincere. She replied with cautious hope. Later that week they met in a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. Charles stood when she arrived, wearing a simple navy sweater. His handshake was warm, his eyes steady. They talked for hours about education, children, the things standardized tests never measured. He never asked about the incident. He only asked what she would do if she had another chance. And in that moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe she still did. New Hope Academy was nothing like Jefferson Elementary. There were no polished marble floors or metal detectors, no automated bell system, no harsh white lights flickering above tense, orderly hallways. Instead, the school sat nestled between two tall oak trees, its brick exterior weathered but warm, windows open to let in fresh air even in early spring. The building was smaller than Sarah expected, almost like a house repurposed into something softer, something that invited you to exhale. Children's laughter floated through the air as she stepped inside for the first time. The front office smelled faintly of cinnamon and pencil shavings. On one wall hung a mural, painted, it seemed, by the students themselves, of hands reaching toward a sun made of book pages. Beneath it, a phrase had been painted in sweeping gold letters: "We learn by heart." Charles met her in the hallway, holding a cup of coffee and a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He smiled, not the practiced, tight-lipped kind she had seen so often in school administrators, but a smile that reached the corners of his eyes. "Welcome to New Hope, Ms. Ellis," he said. "Let me show you around." As they walked, Sarah noticed the students. They did not rush or shuffle anxiously. They waved to Charles, who greeted each one by name. In the classrooms, beanbags and mismatched chairs replaced rows of desks. There were plants in the windowsills, art on the walls, and shelves of worn paperbacks with sticky notes poking from their spines. "This is a school?" Sarah asked softly, half to herself. Charles glanced at her and grinned. "We like to think so. A school without walls, not literally, but in spirit. We do not search for perfect teachers here, just those brave enough to love." They stopped at the door of what would be her classroom. Sarah stepped inside, took a breath, and let her eyes sweep the room. The whiteboard was scuffed but clean. A rug sat in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs that did not match. A tall window opened to the schoolyard, where a garden patch peeked from behind a fence. She set her bag down on the desk and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen. Her first day began quietly. 12 students, all between ages 9 and 11, filed in with cautious curiosity. They were different from the students at Jefferson. There was a boy who tapped the edge of his chair every 3 seconds, a girl who wore a winter hat indoors and refused to take it off, a tall boy with downcast eyes and no backpack. But they watched her. They listened. Sarah started the day with a story, an old book with cracked pages and a faded cover. Her voice was soft at first, uncertain, but as the children leaned in, eyes widening, she grew steadier. They asked questions. They laughed at the funny parts. One even clapped at the end. She wrote their names on the board, one by one, asking each child to tell her something they loved. One said birds. Another said, quiet. One whispered, the sound of my brother coming home. Charles watched from the door for a moment, unnoticed. He saw the way Sarah tilted her head as she listened, how she crouched beside a student rather than standing above them. how she handed out pencils like they were golden keys to a different world. During lunch, he passed by her room again. She was on the floor, helping a girl tie her shoelaces. The girl looked up at her, eyes wide and uncertain. Sarah smiled gently and said something he could not hear. The girl smiled back. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip and the students packed their bags, Sarah sat at her desk, looking out the window. Her eyes were tired but bright. In her drawer was an apple, not from her but from a student. It was not bruised, not polished, just an apple, left quietly. Charles knocked on the open door. "How was day one?" he asked. Sarah turned, and for the first time since leaving Jefferson, she smiled fully. It felt like breathing again. He nodded, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Good, you belong here." She watched him leave, his steps quiet, his shoulders relaxed. Alone in the classroom, she looked around at the messy bulletin board, the scuffed rug, the half-read books scattered across desks. It was not perfect, but it was alive, and for the first time in a long while, so was she. It was a rainy Thursday when Jack appeared again. Sarah was in the middle of her morning routine, laying out vocabulary cards on the classroom rug, when the receptionist tapped gently on her door. "Miss Ellis, there's someone at the gate asking for you," she said hesitantly. Sarah blinked. "A parent?" The woman shook her head. "No, a boy. Says he knows you. He would not come inside." Heart suddenly pounding, Sarah hurried through the front office and stepped outside into the misty morning air. The school gate, just beyond the picket fence, creaked slightly in the wind. And there, standing under a crooked umbrella that looked too large for his narrow shoulders, was Jack. He had grown taller, but he still had the same solemn eyes, the same too-thin frame, the same silence clinging to him like a second skin. His coat was damp and frayed at the cuffs. His shoes, different now but still worn, squished softly in the puddles beneath him. "Jack?" Sarah whispered, stepping forward. She dropped to her knees, umbrella forgotten, raindrops falling into her golden hair. Jack stared at her, unmoving. For a second, it seemed he might turn and run. Then, in a fragile voice, he asked, "Is this a safe school?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She nodded, tears already threatening to spill. "Yes, baby, it is." She reached out slowly, cautiously, until Jack stepped into her arms. He did not hug tightly, just rested his head against her shoulder, as though testing the moment. She felt him trembling. She gently rubbed his back, whispering, "Have you eaten today?" He nodded against her, but she felt the lie. From a short distance, Charles stood beneath the covered walkway, watching the scene unfold. He said nothing, just pressed one hand to his chest, as though to still something in himself. Then, quietly, he turned and walked back inside. Inside the school cafeteria, Sarah sat Jack down at a small round table. She brought him a peanut butter sandwich, a carton of milk, and an apple. He ate in small, slow bites, barely making a sound. "I didn't know where you went," she said softly. "After I left," Jack shrugged, "we moved, a lot. My mom, she was sick for a while. Then she got better, then worse again." "We're in a shelter now." Sarah swallowed hard. "Do you live close?" "2 bus rides," he said. "But I remembered the name of this school. I saw it once in a newspaper with your name." Her heart twisted. "You came looking for me?" Jack glanced up from his sandwich. "You're the only person who ever looked at me like I mattered." Charles came over later with enrollment forms. He pulled up a chair beside Jack, his voice low and kind. "No uniforms here, no tests that measure your worth. Just effort, kindness, and a little curiosity. Sound fair?" Jack nodded slowly. "We'll talk to your guardian later," Charles added, "but for now, you're welcome here." Jack blinked up at him. "Are you the principal?" "I suppose I am," Charles said with a small smile. "Do you like books?" "I love them." Jack looked at Sarah, then back at Charles. "Then I think I'm going to like it here." Over the next few weeks, Jack became a quiet fixture in Sarah's classroom. He never fought for attention. He did not need to. She had always known how to see him. He arrived early each day, sometimes with a half-eaten granola bar, sometimes with nothing but his notebook. Sarah made sure there was always a muffin on her desk and a folded blanket in the reading corner. He never asked for either, but they disappeared just the same. Charles often watched from afar, during lunch, during free periods. He saw how Sarah never forced Jack to speak, but gently nudged him toward connection. She encouraged him to draw, to write stories, to build bridges out of wooden blocks. One afternoon, Jack wrote a short story about a paper boat that survived a storm, because someone had whispered courage into its sails. At the end of the day, Sarah handed the story to Charles. "He is healing," she said. Charles nodded. "So are you." The three of them formed an unspoken rhythm, Sarah with her quiet presence, Jack with his fragile trust, Charles with his steady support. They read together, sometimes all three on the classroom rug, passing pages like prayers. They ate sandwiches and shared silent laughter over comic strips. They never called it therapy, but it was. It was healing through proximity, through stillness, through being seen and not questioned. One afternoon, Jack handed Sarah a folded piece of paper. Inside was a sketch, a woman with blonde hair holding the hand of a boy beside a small school with big windows. Standing just behind them was a man with kind eyes, holding an umbrella above them both. Sarah looked up at Jack. He only smiled faintly. Charles, passing by, paused. "Good drawing." Jack shrugged. "I just drew what I see." Charles looked at Sarah and smiled. So did he. The morning sun filtered through the wide classroom windows, casting golden light across the rug where Sarah and Charles sat among a circle of second graders. Today's lesson was part of their weekly life skills class, something New Hope Academy cherished as much as math or reading. This morning's theme was kindness and family, two concepts the school believed could never be taught too early. Sarah held up a handmade poster covered in colorful handprints. "What do you think makes a family?" she asked, her blonde hair catching the light like a halo. "Love," said one little girl with pigtails. "Hugs," added a boy, lifting both arms for emphasis. "Someone who shares their cookies," another chimed in, and the room erupted with giggles. Charles, sitting cross-legged next to Sarah, smiled warmly and said, "Those are all perfect answers. Families come in many forms. Some are big, some small, some with grandparents, some with moms and dads, some with friends who become family." As Sarah leaned forward to hand out little paper hearts for the kids to write on, one small boy, James, a curious child with a constant smudge on his nose, suddenly tilted his head and asked, "Miss Sarah, are you and Mr. Charles married?" The room went silent for a heartbeat, then exploded into giggles and squeals. Charles coughed softly, his ears visibly turning red. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she smiled gently and composed herself. "No, sweetheart," she said, kneeling so she could look James in the eye. "We are not married." James blinked. "But you laughed together like my mom and dad." Sarah chuckled, the warmth in her voice like sunlight. "That is because Mr. Charles is a very special person. Sometimes, love doesn't have to mean getting married. Love can mean listening, helping, caring. It can mean making sure someone is never left behind." She looked around at the sea of wide eyes and added, "Mr. Charles and I, we care deeply about everyone here. We are not husband and wife, but we are part of this big, messy, beautiful family called New Hope, and we both love this family very much." Charles watched her with something unreadable in his eyes. Admiration, certainly, respect, but something softer too, something that made his chest ache a little in the best way. The students returned to their activity, writing what family meant to them on the hearts and taping them to the wall. As they worked, Sarah stood to help one child spell forgiveness, and Charles quietly stepped out to handle a phone call. When the lesson ended and the children filed out for recess, the room slowly settled into its usual quiet hum. Sarah moved to the desk, organizing the hearts they had collected, smiling at the ones scrawled with phrases like snacks, holding hands, and someone who comes back. That was when she noticed the note. It was a small slip of paper tucked under her notebook. Folded once, neat and square, it carried the scent of his cologne, just faint enough to make her breath pause. She opened it slowly. It read, "I am not your husband, but if ever I am lucky enough to be your companion in the long run, it would be the honor of my life." Her fingers trembled just slightly. She glanced toward the door, but Charles had not returned. For a moment she sat quietly at the desk, the paper held to her chest. It was not a grand declaration, it was not loud or showy, but it was everything Sarah had learned to value. Gentle, honest, brave without needing to be bold. That afternoon, when Charles reappeared with a stack of files in hand, he passed by her desk without a word, but their eyes met for a brief second. She smiled. He smiled back. Nothing else was said, but the air between them carried something new, something tender, and in the silence, Sarah felt the same thing she had once felt when she opened her desk drawer and found a bruised apple from a child who had nothing else to give. She felt seen, chosen, cared for. Maybe it was not love the way fairy tales told it, but it was the kind that grew slowly, gently, like roots under the floor of a classroom, where hope lived and breathed in quiet corners. The email arrived on a Monday morning, written in stiff language and wrapped in polite venom. It came from the office of Victoria Langford, a prominent donor and parent of a sixth-grade student at New Hope Academy. Her message was short but pointed. She had serious concerns about the perceived personal relationship between Ms. Sarah Ellis and Headmaster Charles Cole, and she believed it undermined the professional integrity of the institution. If the matter was not addressed immediately, she would be withdrawing her financial support, effective at the end of the quarter. The threat was clear. Over $30,000 in scholarships, field trips, and student meals were tied to her name. Sarah sat at her desk, the letter printed and folded in her lap. Her cheeks were pale, her breath unsteady. "I do not want this to become a scandal," she said quietly as Charles closed the door behind him. "This school, these kids, they should not suffer because of whispers." Charles, standing across from her, crossed his arms. "You have done nothing wrong." "It does not matter," Sarah said, voice tight. "It is about what it looks like. What people choose to believe." "She is choosing to see what fits her narrative," Charles replied, his jaw set. "That is not your responsibility." Sarah looked away, staring out the window, where a few students ran laughing through the garden. "Maybe I should step down from the mentorship program. Just for now. Let things cool down." "No," he said, firmer than she expected. "You are not hiding. Not for this. But the donation. I would rather lose money than ask you to disappear." The tension grew as the week went on. Whispers in the hallway, a few parents canceling appointments. One local blog post speculated about favoritism and blurred lines between professionalism and emotion. Then came the school board meeting. It was held in the multi-purpose room, under the soft glow of mismatched ceiling lights. Folding chairs lined up in careful rows, parents, staff, and community members gathered, many watching Charles and Sarah with unreadable expressions. Victoria Langford sat near the front, her polished nails gleaming as she flipped through printed notes. When Charles took the stage, he looked briefly at Sarah, who stood near the door, heart thudding in her chest. He cleared his throat and began. "There have been concerns raised about impropriety within our staff. Specifically, that a relationship, perceived or real, between two adults could tarnish this school's image." A murmur passed through the crowd. "I will say this plainly," Charles continued. "Ms. Sarah Ellis is one of the most principled, compassionate, and professional educators I have ever worked with. Her presence at New Hope has changed lives, including mine." Victoria's brow arched. "I understand the power of appearances," Charles said, "and I understand the importance of financial support, but I will not sacrifice integrity for comfort. I will not ask a good woman to step back because someone else feels uncomfortable with kindness." He let the silence stretch. "This school was founded on the belief that people are more important than optics. that we stand up for one another, that we do not trade sincerity for donations." He turned toward Victoria directly. "And you feel this vision no longer aligns with your expectations. We thank you for your past support, and we wish you well." Gasps echoed around the room. Victoria rose, lips pressed tight, and walked out without a word. There was a long pause. Then someone clapped. One clap. Then another. A slow, rising wave of applause filled the room. After the meeting, Charles found Sarah outside, standing under a maple tree in the cool twilight. "You did not have to do that," she whispered. "I did," he said, "and I would again." The next week, small envelopes began arriving at the school. Anonymous checks, handwritten notes from local shopkeepers. A former student's mother sent a letter with a $20 bill. "For the woman who taught my son that being poor was not shameful." The donation deficit closed faster than anyone expected. And in the end, New Hope was richer, not in money but in loyalty, in truth, in the kind of courage that could not be bought. Jack had grown taller, his shoulders had filled out, and he walked with quiet confidence now. The boy who once whispered instead of spoke, who flinched at loud noises and sat at the edges of the room, now stood at the center of every classroom discussion. His notebooks were filled with essays, sketches, and reflections. He still preferred to listen more than he talked, but when he did speak, people leaned in to hear. He was 17 now, a senior at New Hope Academy, and one of its most beloved students. When the state's Department of Education announced an open call for student speakers at the Regional Education Conference, Charles nominated Jack without hesitation. At first, Jack shook his head. "I'm not someone people want to listen to." But Sarah had smiled gently and said, "You have something to say that only you can." That was enough. The conference was held in a hotel ballroom an hour outside the city. Dozens of schools were present. When Jack stepped up to the podium, wearing a borrowed blazer and his usual beat-up sneakers, the room quieted. He took a slow breath, glanced toward the crowd, where Sarah and Charles sat side by side, and began. "I was not supposed to be here," he said simply. "Not just at this conference, but at any school where I felt safe, or wanted, or seen." He paused, letting the silence settle around him. "When I was 10, I thought being invisible was safer than being noticed. I thought kindness was a trick. That hope was something only other kids were allowed to have. Then one teacher gave me a sandwich and never asked for anything in return." He smiled faintly. "She let me stay after class when I was too scared to go home. She never told me I was broken. She just waited for me to speak, and when I finally did, she listened." Another pause. "She and the man who runs my school, they built something rare, a place where no one has to earn their worth, where love is not conditional, where silence is not mistaken for apathy." He looked directly at Sarah. "She did not just pull me out of poverty. She taught me that I deserved love, that I had value, even when I had nothing to give." There was a stillness in the room as he stepped away from the microphone. Then applause rose slowly, first polite, then rising into something heartfelt. Later that month, at New Hope, Sarah and Charles introduced a new tradition, Gratitude Day. Every student received a blank card and was asked to write to someone in the school who had changed their life. Most cards were sweet, simple, joyful. "Thanks for always sharing your gum. Thanks for making math not terrible. Thanks for being my safe place." Jack's note was left on Sarah's desk in a plain envelope, no name on the front. Inside, his handwriting was steady. "You did not just feed me. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning. You reminded me, over and over, without ever saying it, that I mattered, that I was worth saving. You taught me how to love by loving me first." Sarah read it alone, after the students had gone for the day. Her eyes filled, not with sadness, but something deeper, a gratitude that swelled in her chest like a quiet hymn. Charles found her standing at the window, the card still in her hand. "Jack?" he asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak. He stood beside her for a long moment, neither of them needing to say anything. Outside, the garden was starting to bloom again, daffodils pushing through soil, children laughing in the fading light. In that stillness, Sarah reached out and took Charles's hand. Not a secret, not a statement, just something real, held quietly between them, like everything that truly mattered. The halls of New Hope Academy looked as they always had, sunlight streaming through tall windows, artwork taped lovingly to the walls, the faint scent of pencil shavings and old books. But today something felt different. Jack stood in front of room 2B, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the door. Inside, the room was still and sunlit, waiting. He walked to the desk, his desk now, and opened the top drawer. Carefully, he placed a single polished red apple inside. The skin was smooth, the stem curved neatly. It was not for a student. It was for her. For the woman who had once placed apples in her drawer for children who had nothing, for the one who had seen him when he was invisible. Outside, Charles stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the boy he once read about in a newspaper years ago. Jack had grown. He was taller, more sure-footed, but his eyes still carried that deep, quiet strength. "First day," Charles said. Jack turned and nodded. "Feels like I've been walking toward this since I was 10. Charles smiled and stepped inside. "Nervous?" Jack exhaled. "Terrified. That's how you know you're ready." The two sat for a moment, side by side. The past seemed to hum between them, unspoken but understood. When the bell rang and footsteps echoed in the hallway, Jack stood. "I've got this," he said, trying to sound confident. Charles rested a hand on his shoulder. He always did. Down the hallway, Sarah was greeting students as they arrived. Her hair was shorter now, with soft silver strands framing her face. Her wedding ring caught the morning light as she handed out folders and warm smiles. When she saw Jack standing in his doorway, she paused and pressed her hand gently over her heart. He met her gaze and gave a small nod. She smiled. The day moved quickly. Jack read books aloud, answered questions, calmed a nervous child. It felt natural, like he had never left this place, like he belonged. That evening, the school hosted a ceremony to welcome its new teachers. Families filled the small auditorium, strung with lights and filled with laughter. Charles spoke first, briefly, then invited Jack to the stage. Jack stood at the podium, nervous but steady. His eyes scanned the room, Charles at the side of the stage, Sarah seated in the front row. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Jack began. "For a long time, I didn't think I'd be standing anywhere at all." He paused. The room quieted. "When I was 10, I was lost, hungry, forgotten. But a teacher didn't turn away. She saw me. She fed me, listened to me, and stayed when no one else did." He turned his gaze toward Sarah. "She didn't just teach me to read. She taught me that I mattered." Then Jack looked to Charles. "And another person. He stood by her when the world tried to push her down. He showed me that real leaders protect not just rules, but people, especially the people who love." Jack's voice grew stronger. "I'm here because a teacher didn't abandon me, and because a headmaster didn't abandon her." The room was silent. Then a wave of applause filled the space, loud and heartfelt. Later, as the crowd thinned and twilight filled the windows with gold, Charles found Sarah near the back. They stood in the warm hush of the moment. "I never taught you anything," Charles said softly. Sarah smiled and leaned into him. "But you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple, "taught me everything about the heart." They looked across the room at Jack, laughing with a group of students. The apple still sat in his drawer, quietly glowing. And in that light, New Hope felt more than just a school. It felt like a promise fulfilled. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, resilience, and the quiet power of compassion. Jack's story reminds us that one act of kindness can echo through a lifetime, and sometimes the most life-changing lessons are taught not with chalk and textbooks, but with open hearts. If this story touched your soul, Imagine how many others are waiting to do the same. Become part of a community that believes in the beauty of real-life miracles, gentle heroes, and unforgettable moments. Turn on notifications, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and help us continue spreading stories that heal, inspire, and move hearts. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of a single apple in the right hands.